Secrets have power. They shape lives, twist relationships, and sometimes they end them. So-called quiet morning in July 2020, Bernadette's stepfather picked her up from a family home. It was supposed to be an ordinary drive, a routine moment between parent and child. But she was never seen again. And in those hours that followed, something irreversible took place. What exactly happened during that time, and why has no one, even to this day, been able to find her? This is not just the story of a missing teenager. It is a narrative of betrayal, a web of lies spun by the very people meant to protect her, a story where the lines between love and loyalty become tragically blurred and the quest for justice runs headlong into a wall of silence. Shekels, sir. Today we piece together the fragments of Bernadette Walker's life. We trace the moments leading to her disappearance, the investigation that unraveled an unthinkable conspiracy, and the courtroom drama that exposed truths no family should ever endure. But even now, one question still remains unanswered. Where is Bernadette? What do you do when the person responsible for revealing the truth is the one hiding it? This is the story of Bernadette Walker, and this is the question that will haunt you long after you hear it. Bernadette Walker was only 17 years old. A bright, creative photography student, she had her entire future ahead of her. Friends and teachers described her as kind, passionate, and full of potential. She had an eye for capturing the world through her lens, a world she hoped to one day explore beyond her hometown of Peterborough, England. But that dream was abruptly cut short in the summer of 2020, when Bernadette disappeared without a trace. At first glance, her disappearance seemed like a tragic case of a teenager running away, but as investigators dug deeper, a much darker story began to emerge. A story of betrayal, manipulation, and a family torn apart by secrets. At the center of this mystery stands Bernadette's stepfather, Scott Walker, a man entrusted with her care. Instead, he would become the primary suspect in her disappearance and eventual murder. Alongside him is Sarah Walker, Bernadette's mother, accused of helping to fabricate lies to cover up her daughter's fate. Together they wove a web of deception so intricate that even now the truth feels elusive. But what makes this case even more devastating is what led to her disappearance. Just days before she vanished, Bernadette confided in her mother, revealing allegations of sexual abuse by Scott Walker. Instead of protecting her, Sarah dismissed her cries for help, a decision that would have fatal consequences. This case is more than a story of loss. It's a haunting reminder of the consequences of silence. It raises uncomfortable questions about the very people we trust to protect us. It shines a spotlight on the fragility of familial bonds when lies and betrayal take hold. And, most importantly, it underscores the critical importance of listening to survivors, especially when their voices are the only shields they have. But what exactly happened to Bernadette Walker? How did a family's secrets lead to such unimaginable tragedy? And why even now is the truth still incomplete? To answer these questions, we must start at the beginning, where a young girl's life intersected with a man's desperate attempt to bury the truth forever. On the morning of July 18, 2020, Bernadette Walker left her grandparents' house where she had been staying for a short time. Her stepfather, Scott Walker, was supposed to drive her back home, a seemingly routine trip. But it was the last time anyone would see her alive. According to Scott Walker, the drive began uneventfully. He claimed that Bernadette became upset, accusing him of abuse once again. He later stated that she abruptly got out of the car and ran off, leaving him behind. But there's one glaring issue with his story. Bernadette never arrived home, and no one ever saw her again. Investigators would soon discover that during this drive, Scott's phone was switched off for a crucial 91 minutes. What happened during those 91 minutes has become the focal point of this investigation. Prosecutors believe it was during this time that Scott Walker murdered Bernadette and disposed of her body. But without a body, proving what happened would rely entirely on circumstantial evidence and unraveling the web of lies that Scott and Sarah Walker would spin in the days that followed. When questioned about Bernadette's disappearance, Scott and Sarah Walker maintained that she had run away. They even went as far as sending messages from her phone to family members and friends, pretending to be Bernadette. These messages were carefully crafted to paint the picture of a rebellious teenager who had decided to leave home on her own terms. But there were inconsistencies, small details that didn't add up. The tone of the messages didn't match Bernadette's usual communication style, and her social media activity abruptly stopped. Forensic experts would later confirm that these messages were sent by Sarah and Scott Walker, a desperate attempt to cover up the truth. Despite their efforts to deceive, suspicions quickly fell on Scott Walker. His version of events was riddled with contradictions, and his behavior after Bernadette's disappearance raised red flags. Investigators began to suspect that the concerned stepfather was anything but. In the days following Bernadette's disappearance, Scott's actions painted a troubling picture. He was seen driving to remote locations late at night, spending hours in areas known for their seclusion. Surveillance footage captured him purchasing items that investigators believed could have been used to dispose of evidence. But without concrete proof, these details were not enough to bring charges against him, at least not yet. Meanwhile, Sarah Walker played her part in maintaining the illusion that Bernadette was still alive. She accessed her daughter's social media accounts, posting updates and responding to messages as if nothing was amiss. But her performance was far from convincing, and it only deepened investigators' resolve to uncover the truth. As the days turned into weeks, the search for Bernadette intensified. Police scoured fields, rivers, and wooded areas around Peterborough, but their efforts yielded no trace of her. The lack of a body made the case infinitely more challenging, leaving investigators to rely on the digital and circumstantial evidence they had painstakingly gathered. But even without physical evidence, the pattern of lies told by Scott and Sarah Walker began to unravel. Investigators were closing in, and it was only a matter of time before the truth, or as much of it as could be uncovered, would come to light. July 18, 2020. It was a Saturday morning like any other, quiet and uneventful, with no signs of the tragedy about to unfold. Bernadette Walker was staying at her grandparents' house, a place that had become her safe haven in recent days. She had spent time there after a heated argument with her mother and stepfather about the allegations she had made against Scott Walker. That morning, Scott Walker arrived to pick Bernadette up. According to him, the plan was simple: to talk things through and resolve the tension. To an outsider, it might have seemed like a step toward reconciliation. But what happened next would shatter that illusion entirely. The drive started normally enough, but at some point Scott's phone went dark. For 91 minutes, his device was switched off, an absence of communication that would later become the focal point of the investigation. When his phone came back online, Bernadette was gone. Scott claimed she had jumped out of the car and run off, angry and upset. But no one witnessed this, and no trace of Bernadette was ever found. What exactly happened during those 91 minutes? Did Bernadette willingly leave the car? Did Scott act alone, or was this premeditated? These questions would haunt investigators as they pieced together the events of that day. But one thing was clear: the truth likely died with Scott Walker's version of the story. Scott returned home later that day, but he wasn't alone in the aftermath. Sarah Walker, Bernadette's mother, played a crucial role in what would become a carefully orchestrated cover-up. Instead of reporting Bernadette missing, Scott and Sarah claimed she had run away. They went as far as sending messages from her phone to friends and family, pretending to be Bernadette. The messages were an attempt to create the illusion of a rebellious teenager who had decided to leave home. In one, she claimed she was staying with a friend. In another, she mentioned needing space. But as time went on, cracks began to show in their story. The tone of the messages didn't match Bernadette's typical communication style, and her sudden silence on social media raised alarm bells. While Sarah continued to pose as Bernadette online, Scott's actions became increasingly suspicious. CCTV footage captured him driving to remote areas late at night. He made unexplained trips to hardware stores, buying items investigators later believed were intended to conceal evidence. But what exactly was he doing? And more importantly, where was Bernadette? Despite their efforts, the story began to crumble. Friends and family grew suspicious of the conflicting accounts, and the police were soon involved. The walls were closing in on Scott and Sarah Walker. Their deception had bought them time, but not much. And as investigators began to unravel the truth, the full scale of what had happened would leave everyone reeling. The search for Bernadette Walker officially began on July 21, 2020, 3 days after she was last seen. By this time, Scott and Sarah Walker had already planted their story. Bernadette had run away, upset over a family argument. To the outside world, this seemed plausible at first. Teenagers run away all the time. But to the police, something about their account didn't add up. From the very beginning, Scott Walker's behavior raised red flags. When interviewed, he appeared detached, offering vague and inconsistent details about the last time he saw Bernadette. His claim that she had run off seemed rehearsed, lacking any genuine concern for her safety. Investigators noted his calm demeanor, unusual for a parent whose child was missing. Scott's movements in the days following Bernadette's disappearance were even more suspicious. Surveillance cameras captured him making late-night drives to remote areas and visiting locations that seemed entirely unrelated to the search for Bernadette. Investigators began to suspect these trips weren't innocent, but were instead part of a calculated effort to hide the evidence of his crime. While Scott's actions drew scrutiny, Sarah Walker's involvement in the aftermath raised even more questions. She claimed to be a worried mother, but her behavior suggested something far more sinister. Forensic analysis revealed that Sarah had accessed Bernadette's social media accounts after her disappearance. She sent messages to friends and posted updates, all in an effort to create the illusion that Bernadette was still alive. But her attempts to cover up the truth were far from perfect. Friends noticed inconsistencies in the messages, with phrases and words that didn't sound like Bernadette. These discrepancies became key pieces of evidence, helping investigators dismantle the narrative Scott and Sarah were desperately trying to maintain. Despite their suspicions, investigators faced a significant obstacle. Bernadette's body was nowhere to be found. Without physical evidence, the case was largely circumstantial, relying on digital footprints, behavioral patterns, and inconsistencies in Scott and Sarah's stories. This made building a strong case incredibly difficult, as the defense could argue that Bernadette had truly run away and was alive somewhere. Prosecutors knew they needed to rely on the small but telling details: Scott's 91-minute blackout window, Sarah's access to Bernadette's accounts, and the complete lack of independent sightings of Bernadette after July 18. These pieces, while indirect, painted a picture of deliberate deception. Investigators meticulously pieced together the timeline of events. They tracked Scott's movements using CCTV footage and phone records, revealing trips to remote locations that he couldn't explain. Forensic experts analyzed Sarah's digital activity, uncovering her role in fabricating messages and maintaining the illusion that Bernadette was alive. Together, these pieces of evidence created a damning narrative of guilt and complicity. But even with a growing mountain of circumstantial evidence, one critical question remained unanswered. Where was Bernadette? And without her body, could prosecutors prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Scott Walker was guilty of murder? The jury believed Scott Walker guilty. for premature maternity loss from her babies with Scott the prior year. The trial of Scott and Sarah Walker began in June 2021, nearly a year after Bernadette's disappearance. It was a case that captivated the public, not only for its tragic details, but for the immense challenge prosecutors faced, proving a murder without a body. In the courtroom, Scott Walker maintained his innocence, repeating the claim that Bernadette had run away. Sarah, on the other hand, found herself caught in the crossfire, her conflicting statements and actions making her a central figure in the case. From the very beginning of the trial, Scott Walker's defense strategy was clear: deny everything and cast doubt. His lawyers argued that Bernadette was alive, insisting there was no concrete evidence to prove otherwise. They pointed to the lack of a body, no eyewitnesses, and no forensic evidence directly linking him to a crime scene. To the defense, this was a story of a rebellious teenager who simply wanted to disappear. But prosecutors saw through this facade. They painted a very different picture of Scott Walker, a man who had everything to lose if Bernadette's allegations of sexual abuse were proven true. They argued that his 91-minute window of unaccounted time was no coincidence, and that his calculated actions afterward, disposing of evidence, fabricating messages, and manipulating Sarah, were those of a man desperate to bury the truth. Sarah Walker's role in the trial was equally pivotal. Initially, she stood by Scott's story, claiming Bernadette had run away. But under the pressure of cross-examination, her testimony began to unravel. Prosecutors presented evidence of her accessing Bernadette's social media accounts and sending fake messages to friends and family. These actions, they argued, were not those of a concerned mother, but of someone actively participating in a cover-up. Sarah's shifting testimony only deepened the jury's suspicions. At one point, she admitted that Scott had told her Bernadette was gone, but claimed she didn't know what that meant. This vague and evasive statement became a focal point for the prosecution, highlighting her complicity in the web of lies. At that time, she too was lonely and selfish, because I was miserable, and the longer she wept, the more. The absence of Bernadette's body presented an enormous challenge for prosecutors. Without physical evidence, the case relied on circumstantial details and digital forensics. They leaned heavily on Scott's 91-minute phone blackout, his unexplained late-night trips to remote locations, and Sarah's involvement in maintaining the illusion that Bernadette was alive. Prosecutors also highlighted the motive: Bernadette's allegations of sexual abuse against Scott Walker. They argued that he had silenced her to protect himself, knowing that her claims could destroy his life. With Sarah's assistance, he had crafted a narrative designed to buy them time that ultimately worked against them as investigators uncovered more inconsistencies. On July 26, 2021, after weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached its verdict. Scott Walker was found guilty of murder and perverting the course of justice. The judge described him as manipulative and calculating, sentencing him to life in prison with a minimum term of 32 years. Sarah Walker was convicted of perverting the course of justice and sentenced to 6 years in prison. Though her actions were not directly tied to Bernadette's death, her role in the cover-up was undeniable. The judge stated that her failure to protect her daughter and her willingness to assist Scott in his lies were a betrayal of unimaginable proportions. Though justice was served in the courtroom, one question still lingers: where is Bernadette Walker? Despite extensive searches and countless appeals for information, her body has never been found. For her friends and family, the lack of closure is a wound that refuses to heal. Scott Walker took the truth to his grave, passing away in December 2023 while serving his sentence. To this day, he never revealed what happened during those 91 minutes, leaving Bernadette's family to grapple with the unanswered questions that haunt them still. Even with the conviction of Scott and Sarah Walker, the story of Bernadette Walker remains heartbreakingly incomplete. The courtroom verdict brought justice, but it did not bring answers to the questions that continue to torment those who loved her. The most haunting question of all is the one that remains unanswered. Where is Bernadette Walker? Despite exhaustive searches of rivers, fields, and forests, her body has never been found. Investigators believe Scott Walker disposed of her remains during those critical 91 minutes when his phone was switched off, but the exact location, perhaps intentionally chosen for its remoteness, has eluded even the most determined efforts to uncover the truth. Without this crucial piece of evidence, Bernadette's family is left without the closure they so desperately need. The absence of her body denies them the chance to lay her to rest, to say goodbye in a way that every family deserves. For them, her absence is a wound that time cannot heal. Another question that lingers is Sarah Walker's role in this tragedy. Why did she choose to side with Scott, even after Bernadette confided in her about years of abuse? Why did she prioritize protecting a man over her own daughter? For many, Sarah's actions remain one of the most inexplicable and heartbreaking aspects of this case. Some have speculated that Sarah was manipulated by Scott, caught in his web of lies and control. Others believe her actions were motivated by fear or denial, unable to confront the horrifying truth of what was happening in her own home. Whatever the reason, her betrayal is a tragic reminder of how blind loyalty can lead to devastating consequences.
In December 2023, Scott Walker died while serving his life sentence. His death marked the end of a life defined by manipulation and violence, but it also took with it the secrets he refused to reveal. To his final day, Scott never admitted to what truly happened during those 91 minutes, nor did he disclose the location of Bernadette's body. For investigators, Scott's silence is a frustrating end to a case that was already fraught with challenges. For Bernadette's family, it's an unbearable loss of hope. The chance that one day he might tell them where to find her, now gone forever.
Bernadette Walker's story is one of heartbreak and injustice, but it is also a call to action. It highlights the importance of believing survivors, of listening to those who gather the courage to speak out. No matter how difficult their truths may be, it's a reminder that silence, whether imposed by fear or complicity, can be as destructive as the actions themselves. For now, Bernadette's family, friends, and supporters continue to seek answers, holding on to the hope that one day they might find the closure they so deeply deserve. Until then, her story remains an unfinished chapter, a painful reminder of a life taken too soon. What do you think truly happened during those 91 minutes? Could Scott Walker have acted alone, or was there more to the story than we know? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective could shed new light on this chilling case, and we'd love to hear what you think. If you found this case as haunting and thought-provoking as we did, don't forget to like this video. Your support helps us bring more true crime stories to light, diving deep into the mysteries that deserve to be told. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. We explore the darkest corners of true crime, uncovering the details that demand to be heard. Thank you for watching. Together, let's keep the memory of Bernadette Walker alive and continue seeking the truth for those who can no longer speak for themselves. Bernadette Walker was just 17 years old. At an age when most teenagers are discovering who they are, dreaming about their futures, and taking their first steps toward independence, Bernadette had dreams too. She had a passion for photography, a gift for seeing the world in ways others often overlooked. Through her lens, she captured not just moments, but feelings. Light filtering through trees, smiles frozen in time, and the quiet beauty of everyday life. She saw the world with an artist's eye, a gift she hoped to one day share with the world. Yet, instead of being met with support, her voice was silenced, dismissed, denied, and ultimately betrayed by those who should have been her protectors. Imagine a world where her voice had been heard, a world where Bernadette's allegations were taken seriously, where her courage was rewarded with action, and where justice came before it was too late. Imagine a mother who stood by her side, shielding her from harm, and a society that prioritized the truth over convenience. But instead, Bernadette was let down by those who were meant to keep her safe. Her story is not just about what was lost, it's about what could have been. Bernadette had her whole life ahead of her. She should have grown up to see her dreams realized, to travel, to love, to laugh, to leave her mark on the world in the way only she could. But all of that was taken from her in an instant of unimaginable betrayal. Bernadette was taken away while living, and the death of her father only added to her anguish. This case is a devastating reminder of the fragility of trust and the devastating consequences of silence. Bernadette's story teaches us that ignoring someone's cries for help is not a neutral act. It's a decision with consequences. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest harm isn't just what's done, but what's ignored. For those of us watching this story unfold, there's a message we cannot ignore. To believe, to listen, and to act. If someone had believed Bernadette, if someone had acted, the outcome might have been so different. Her story is not just a tragedy, it is a call to action, a demand that we do better, that we create a world where voices like Bernadette's are never silenced again. Even in the wake of Scott Walker's death, even with Sarah Walker behind bars, the questions remain. Where is Bernadette? How can her family find closure without knowing the full truth? And how do we, as a society, ensure that stories like hers do not happen again? Her legacy should not be defined by what was taken from her, but by the lessons her story leaves behind. Bernadette Walker's story is a heartbreaking reminder of what we stand to lose when we fail to listen, when we fail to act. It's a story that asks us to reflect not only on justice, but on humanity itself. To honor Bernadette, we must carry her story forward, not as a tragedy, but as a symbol of what must change to protect the vulnerable among us.